Hello and welcome to Water Stories, the podcast. I'm Eve Barro, and this podcast is a production of BioBAT Art Space. As we embark on each episode, we invite you to immerse yourself in exciting discussions that illuminate the vitality of water, echoing the themes explored by the artists featured in our Brooklyn exhibition on show until June 2025. Enjoy! Today we are speaking with Rasa Weber. Rasa is an experimental designer based between Zurich and Berlin with a special interest in materials and critical ecological thinking. Her current research, which is part of her PhD project at the University of the Arts Zurich, investigates new material processes and build habitats within more than human marine environments. Rasa, it's so nice to talk to you today. Thank you so much for accepting to be with us.
Thanks, Eve, for the invitation. I'm very happy to speak to you about ocean environments.
To start off, I was wondering if you could share a bit more about your background and the journey that led you to this project you're conducting on interspecies underwater architecture.
Yeah, my journey into marine environments has been a long one, and I'd say being a designer underwater is quite an impossible or improbable positioning in the fields of practicing arts. I'm originally educated very classically as a product designer, so that's my background, product or industrial design. However, since I've been starting to practice design in more industrial or exhibition contexts, I was always interested or fascinated with materials and the question how ecologies relate to the production and resourcing of different materials. And that brought me from research about microalgae to research about waste materials in urban contexts and architecture to a central question that I wanted to pose in the realm of my PhD, which is how to grow habitats and how does substrates or materials play a role in the well-being of marine critters. And when I came across this possibility of forming artificial habitats in underwater environments, it actually opened a totally new door for me to think about the relationship of the designer to its environment, because design per se is considered as object-oriented, and in the last years it was more touching upon the fact of how we can collaborate with science institutes, for example, in laboratory environments. But posing the question how this is possible in an open environment as the ocean, which is chaotic, messy, and hard to control, to work not only for another species, but together with it, was super, super fascinating for me. That's how I got to the field. And then it became much more concrete by doing my dive certificate, which brought me to the sea, which eventually made it possible to research in the ocean.
That's very interesting. Actually, because you mentioned, that you have your dive certificate, and I know that you do a lot of field work. So I'm wondering if you could give us a sort of brief overview of this practice-based design project that you're conducting, because I know that you've done some field work, I think in Corsica, I think also maybe in Curacao in Colombia. So can you give us an overview of the different forms that this project practically takes?
Yeah, I think the idea of going into the field, although field is already the wrong term because it's not a field, it's a reef. So my reef research is central to my work. The reason why I'm saying this is because classically you would understand design as being situated in studios or laboratory contexts and very rarely in open environments. I'm part of a newly formed research group, which is called Interfacing the Ocean. We are part of a Swiss National Science Fund, and our objective is to really bring design research practices into marine environments from different perspectives. My own question in my project, which is called Symbiotic, is to look into the symbiotic relationships that are at stake in the formation of marine habitat. And there has been a whole tradition in the development, the technological material development of artificial reef environments. So if you look into conservation practices, this has been classically not a design-driven idea, but a lot of marine biologists and conservation ecologists are grappling with the question of, if reef ecologies are in crisis, how can we as humans positively influence these environments? Are we able to preserve them with creating artificial habitat? And for me, this is incredibly interesting on many different levels, because it touches upon the question of politics, on evolutionary biology, and very concretely on the question of how we design these ecological relationships. And symbiotion for me is an investigation into the possibilities of forming artificial habitats with different material substrates as a form of underwater architecture. And if you think about this very concretely, what I'm doing is I build prototypes in different places, such as Corsica and Colombia, in order to test how different materials or material setups and designs are resonating with the marine species. And the places that I found to work most fruitful are, they're very distinct, but each of them is a very interesting to work in. Corsica that's a scientific research station. It's called Staresso. And here I'm working in the little microcosm of marine biology. So usually Corsica is a closed research station that is exclusively accessible to marine scientists. And I'm joining them, and I joined the Institute of Animal Behavior, Max Planck, and the lab is called Jordan Lab, and followed some of the marine biologists in their work to look into their own fieldwork strategies, and then to develop my own design-driven research strategies. And Colombia is different because it follows more the notion of design perspective, citizen science perspective, where we are collaborating with different local players, such as an indigenous group of weavers and local divers, to realize these conservation projects. So it works on different with different communities, but central to it is always a question of how to form the conversation between humans and other than human species around these objects that I'm designing.
It's very interesting to hear about the variety of collaborations that you conduct as part of this research project, because you mentioned this aspect of collaborating with the more than human, then also collaborating with the water that you're working in directly, and then also working with scientists. And you also mentioned that you are involved with an indigenous group of weavers in Colombia. I'm curious about the value in doing such an interdisciplinary work with so many different people that would have different perspectives, people and organisms and individuals that have so many different perspectives on this work that you're conducting.
Yeah, so I think design, or let's say artistic practices per se, have an outstanding role in this debate about the preservation of habitats. I would say I consider myself as, on the one hand, I'm always an intruder, as any human being in marine environments. And that's why the ocean is so great to work with, because it makes us realize, it confronts us with the realization that we humans are only visitors. We can never be a part of these ecologies. We can only be there via mediated machinery, via all the tools that we need to survive underwater. On the other hand, I'm also an intruder in the sense that I'm not part of the classical canon of marine sciences. And what's interesting for me at the moment, and one of the things that drives me, especially around the notion of biopolitics of preserving coral habitat, is the question of how can we implement an alternative reading outside the norm. So many clandestine norms are applied to the life and livelihoods of corals, and we are not even noticing. And as designer, it might be a bit easier to step outside this classical science canon, because my reference points are the points of blue humanities, for example, or queer ecologies that I'm working with in order to understand my own practice. And I'm currently working on formulating these thoughts a bit further, but for me, a queer ecological reading of the ocean implements that or provides that I step outside this idea of looking at the ocean as a sick or a healthy environment, and also not promising as a designer to heal an impaired ecosystem. That's not my objective. My objective to install these prototypes as a means of conversation. And the conversation I'm trying to implement is, on the one hand, a conversation of different species. There could be, for example, right now, a lot of scientists are noticing that coral reefs are changing drastically, not only declining, but they are, for example, wandering north because of climate change. There are some assumptions that coral reefs will exist much further north than they have existed before because of warmer water temperatures. There's a number of invasive species that are suddenly becoming part of ecological relations that haven't been there before. They've always been framed as problematic because we are, as human beings, maybe as romantic human beings, we are implying a certain idea of how a pristine coral reef should look like. And I think it's time, in times of the Anthropocene, to challenge this notion and to understand there's different ways of framing ecologies as, violated, contaminated, blasted, but still worthy of protection, but protection in a different way. So we're not trying to or we are not even able to bring them back to a pristine state as they were in before, but we have to work with the given conditions. And that's what fascinates me. That's why I'm working on creating these objects underwater, these pavilion structures, as a way to illustrate that different forms of lives are allowed to coexist in the same ecosystem, outside the notion of this being pristine, original, healthy, unhealthy, broken, or repaired. And the other part that I wanted to get back to is conversations not only between these different species, but also seeing the human as part of this ecosystem. And that's how, for example, my collaboration with Colombia comes in. And that came in a bit later in my reflection, that I suddenly realized it's not about excluding the human from these ecosystems anymore, because we cannot be excluded anymore. There's no way to even state that the human is not part of a marine ecology, because we are so fundamentally etched into the ecosystem constellations with everything that we've done, from industrial involvement, microplastics, CO2 emissions. We can just not be eliminated anymore from the habitat. So let's rather think about practices of collaboration, co-designing, caring, convivial conservation of the human together with other species. And I think that's really a productive way of thinking about this. And this, coming back to your question, is much easier to state as a designer and an artist than if this would come from marine biology, because marine biology is bound to different funding schemes, bound to different normative notions, let's say.
I think it's so interesting how you mention, if I understand well, trying to go maybe beyond labels that we traditionally assign to aquatic life or ocean environments, as you said, maybe healthy and unhealthy, that things are changing, that it's no more like the environments that we would dream it to be, if I can say. And also, I think it was really interesting how you mentioned, I think, queer ecology. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more on maybe, how your work maybe intersect with queer ecology and what it means for you within your practice.
Yeah, for me, a queer ecological reading of the ocean, looking at the ocean as a queer space, implies to look, on the one hand, at the biopolitical regime that is put on the preservation of life, and on the other hand, on the nature, culture, human binary that we have established for so long. Let's make it a bit more simple. I will give you an example, and that maybe helps to understand what I mean. I was visiting Colombia in November, and I'm going to go back now in February for another field works period there. And everyone, if you come to the island of Tierra Bomba, everyone will tell you about Varadero Reef. Varadero is a reef that is situated right on one of the main trafficking routes to one of the biggest cities, Cartagena. It's situated at a canal that has been digged in 1500 something for colonial reasons and has been used for trafficking ever since. The funny or interesting thing is Varadero is full of pollution. So you would have massive amounts of cargo ships that will pass by every day. It's full of diesel. You have particles in the water. So the conditions are really not ideal. But Varadero is thriving. It's one of the most healthy reefs on the entire coast of Colombia. It's a secret to science why this is the case, but if you speak with Anna Tsing, it's a patch of hope, a small island of hope within aquatic ruins. So everything around has been destroyed by human impact, by industries, by transport and trafficking routes. But Varadero, for some reason, is doing really well. So it's an improbable habitat. And for me, it's a sign that this concept of that Anna Tsing brings about, or also Alexis Shotwell, that they talk about of a blasted landscape, is nothing theoretical. It's quite concrete if you look into marine habitats. So you would have newly forming habitats and coral reefs within devastating conditions. And to think about these newly forming ecosystems that go along with human-made infrastructures is really fundamentally challenging our notion of what do we perceive as worthy to protect. And that has so much to do with the question of queer theory, where we have the same question that is brought upon on human minorities, on bodies, on skin colors, on sexualities. There's always this question of, do we look at a body, a person, a landscape as something impaired, or do we look at this person, this body, this landscape as worthy to be protected, as having its own voice, its own language? And all these debates along the lines of biopolitics, of preserving life, are so fundamental to understanding also our own human condition. And here, I think a queer ecological perspective can really help us to change the debate also within sciences, because in sciences, of course, things happen with a lot of caution based on the notion that we need to preserve what we have while we can, which of course is a fair position, but the reality is things are drastically changing. And then what is brought up right now in a debate, for example, is the question of manipulating coral life. And that again has a lot to do with human reproductive medicine, the way that, for example, we're using CRISPR and DNA technology to preserve the coral genome. It's something that could be just as well discussed on land, on the human body, but in this case, on the coral, it's much easier to look at it because science is a bit more unleashed in the ocean. But to just pose these questions is, I think, a good way to look at ocean relationships right now, because for a long time, the sea has served as an imaginary for the untouched and the pristine.
I think it's fascinating how you link maybe things that you would observe directly in the water or observe in terms of people's relationship with the water, with more broader biopolitics and how we relate with each other, to each other. I think you also mentioned colonial dynamics and like how this could impact maybe the preservation of coral reefs. And there's something that I found really intriguing and that I'd love to know more about in what you said, is that earlier you talked of practices of convivial conservation, and you also mentioned having small bits of hope in aquatic ruins. And I find it really interesting how it's almost the language of care, but in a joyful and loving and convivial way. I'm wondering if you could tell us more about whether there is room for joy, despite the fact that maybe when you study this sort of topic. There's a lot of grief that goes with it.
That's such a good point. It's great that you bring it up. Just as a side note, the term convivial conservation doesn't come from me, but it's based on the work of, for example, the Breakthrough Institute and authors such as Bücher and Fletcher, who published on this idea of convivial conservation as a counter logics to classical conservation paradigms. And I think it's a very fruitful term. To be honest, once you've been in the ocean, finding joy and hope is not so hard, because despite all the devastating circumstances and coral bleaching that I've seen in massive amounts in Colombia this year, it is just fascinating and extremely beautiful to be in underwater environments. And it brings about a certain way of thinking, a temporality of thinking that is, at least for the time of the dive, allows us to step outside the feeling that we are already too late. That's something that a lot of people in conservation ecology are grappling with, this feeling that it's already happening. We don't have enough time. We cannot do anything anymore. Once you are in the ocean, temporality is different. Because you think slower, you act slower, you have to attune to an environment that is per se resistant to movement and resistant to change, at least if you're a human body in the water. And for me, this is a way of thinking that is extremely poetic. For me, finding these moments of hope within my work are, I'd say, are rather bound to tiny encounters. If I'm very honest and open with you about my prototypes, I really don't believe that any conservation project can solve the problem, the global problem of climate crisis and transformation of the climatic regime. We will not be able to answer this with a single prototype. However, these moments of meeting underwater with different species is what gives me hope, at least. And one of the best moments I had so far, or let's say there's two moments that I had with different species visiting my installations. In Curacao, I did my very first prototype. It was tiny. It was barely a material test. But after a week in the water, I came back and I looked at the prototype, and there was this tiny little puffer fish that moved into one of my structures. And the fish was just hanging out there every day. And every time I came back, this fish was still there looking at me. And I was like, oh, wow, he claimed space now, so I'm not allowed to touch it anymore. It turned into the fish's habitat, basically. And I really like that idea that it's not my own property anymore, but it's shared. It's like convivial in the sense of the word. It's a shared habitat suddenly. And the same happened at the vernissage in Colombia, where we put these woven structures into the water. You have to imagine them a bit like baskets. So they're like artisanal baskets. They're about 1.20 meters high, and we had different models in the water, 5 or 6. And at the opening, we were planning to bring a number of tourists and different people from the hotel and from our team to this installation. We brought some Colombian collaborators that have never dived before, which was also really nice. I'm really proud of that. But we also had visitors that were not originally on the guest list, and we just had a bunch of trumpet fishes hanging around. And trumpet fishes are like curious creatures. They are not horizontal, but they usually stand vertical in the water. And they have this sense of shape, which is still magical to me. So one of these trumpet fishes, I don't know what it is, but they can sense how their environment looks like, and they will adapt the shape of the environment. And since these coral nurseries were also vertical, the fish would always go next to the nursery and then bend in the way that the nurseries were bent. So it was really like almost a tender gesture. So the trumpet fish was hanging around during the vernissage of the coral nurseries and just immediately turned it into its own sort of habitat. And I like these moments, like these small moments of encounter where there's species that we originally didn't invite to become part of a habitat, and they just claim it as their own. And I think that's exactly the point of of a more diverse reading of ocean habitats as being open and inviting to different forms of life, as unlikely and unexpected as they are.
I love how there's something in the way you talk, there's something almost playful in those encounters. In how you mentioned discovering this small pufferfish that was just there and they just decided it was their home now. And I love how this emotional bond is created with non-human life. So I'm wondering if during your research, because you mentioned how different it is to work in water as compared to maybe being in a lab or being in a studio. And also, I think when I asked you about joy and grief, you said that once you get in the water, that's when you really understand, and the temporality is different. I have the impression that there's this whole thing about the physicality of it and the embodied experience of being in the water and experiencing this. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about, yes, this ideas of situatedness and being present and having this embodied direct experience of the ocean and of the life that's in the ocean.
Yes, my research group and I are thinking about this question of how design research in oceans can also become a methodology. And we basically think about it around the notion of ecological attunement as a central term. And that resonates, of course, with the musical perspective, like the one of Barro. She's been thinking about this term of attunement in the way that she wrote on sonic meditations. But it also brings up ideas such as the one of Vincent Desprez about tuning into other species' lives. But to make it very concrete, the way that I've touched upon it so far was there is a whole, it's not a long tradition because scuba diving has only been invented 100 something years ago, but the essence of going into underwater environments to research is something that comes from a marine biological perspective. Historically speaking, and I was surprised about this myself, the first attempts to tune into underwater environments through artistic practices come from 1890 or so. So they were marine biological observations of underwater environments, and they brought painters to bring in this possibility of capturing what is there underwater, because of course in the first instance, you didn't have underwater camera or imagery, so you would have to try to sketch what is there underwater. And this idea of painting underwater in situ in the ocean was something that was very fascinating for me because it has this historical reference. And what I do in my own research is I do sketch underwater, which for some people is surprising, but actually marine biology does it all the time. You have waterproof paper, and you can use ordinary pens and you can just sketch what you see underwater. The whole genre of underwater photography and filmmaking is something that is quite accessible now with like lightweight action cams. But in the past, it also had a long history of trying to grasp what is there underwater via photography and film. So this is another dimension that I bring in. And then a lot of it is purely observation or participant observation, shadowing practices from ethnography, where I'm following a marine biologist, where I'm following species, where I'm following the roots of species underwater. And all these methodologies add up to a way of underwater attunement. I would say being underwater, as I said before, remains always mediated. So there's no immediate way of being in the ocean, because anything that you would do is bound to this cyborgian apparatus that you're wearing when you're in the ocean. And what is interesting for me, maybe also for my own trajectory into marine environments, is I started to think about attunement when I just started diving. And I must say it's an advantage, because in the beginning, you're much more alert to the difference it makes to wearing goggles, to having this respirator in your mouth, to having a buoyancy kit, and to having to navigate all these different devices at the same time. You're extremely distracted until you're able to perceive the ocean. So like first couple of dives, you will be busy with just mastering the equipment. After a while, you might manage to master it, but you're still not super sure about yourself in the water. You will hear your own breathing. You will see your mask getting foggy and all these things that you're busy with until you're perceiving what is out there in the ocean around you. And now I'm close to my dive number 100 since I've started the project. And it fundamentally changes my perception on what I see in the ocean. I'm much less busy with my own gear. I'm much more alert about the things that happen outside there, but it doesn't make me better in the way that I'm attuning, because it makes me blind to the apparatus in a way. Now I'm so accustomed to the fact that I have all these things around me that I don't even perceive them anymore. And if I would start to reflect on ocean attunement now, at the point that I'm in, I would probably see more and hear more around me in terms of what is going on in the marine ecology, but I would forget about my own cyborgian existence in the ocean. And one example would be like on the basis of hearing, for example. It's so interesting. In the beginning, like my first dive was such a shock because I was like surrounded by two other dive students that would have their first dive together with me, and we went under the surface, and I was like, oh my God, this is so loud. And I always had these images of the silent world, Jacques Cousteau, the silent ocean. I was like, hell, this is not silent at all. It's like the loudest thing I ever heard. And I can't even depict from where the sound is coming from. And after a while, you get a bit more calm, you're diving, then you start to hear like the sounds, the crickling and crackling of different animals around you. And you would notice that this is not your own body, but there's also other bodies around you that resonate with this ocean. And then if you're again a little more alert to the stuff that happens around you, you suddenly notice, oh, there's a ship coming, and that you hear that ship. And that's super important to notice as a diver, because you don't want to be at the surface when the ship is passing by. You have to lower yourself and to notice all these different factors of ocean critters. Noise pollution is something that comes with a way of tuning into this environment step by step, hearing more and more, seeing more and more. The same about species. In the beginning, as a diver, you don't see any species. Even if your dive instructor would point at it and say, it's there. Do you see the moray eel? It's just there. And you would be like, what? I don't see it. It takes a number of dives until you can distinguish environments like a reef from a species that lives in the reef.
That's so interesting how you almost describe how your attention shifts the more you dive, you pay attention to different things. But you also mentioned that it's really important maybe to remember that you are there with all your apparatus, and that there's this layer maybe between you and your direct experience of the ocean. But I'm thinking by being directly in the water and having these experiences and being able to shift your attention to the ecology around you, does it maybe lead you to reimagine your place within this ecological system, or even imagine what your place could be and building a new imaginary around this?
That's a really good question, because it's touching upon the question of fictions around ocean environments and utopias that have been built around it. As long as humans are able to dive into the ocean, and even before that, there have been different imaginaries about the human as an amphibious species. I'm thinking about Belyaev, for example, a Russian fiction author who's written a book that's called The Amphibia, or Amphibious Human. And this idea, I think humans have always been fascinated with this idea of penetrating yet another unconquered environment, may it be space, may it be the ocean. And that also resonated with a lot of architectural imaginaries. And central to my own research are the papers of architect slash oceanographer. And his name is Wolf Hilberts. He immigrated to the US, I believe, in the 1960s or 70s. And he developed a technology for restoring artificial environments under the name BioRock. So it's a technology that was also patented for a while. But he also started to invent a whole imaginary about growing underwater habitats or growing underwater cities from this technology. And these utopias of living in the ocean as a human, I think, are fascinating, but also problematic, because they once again, just as in space, bring forward this idea of if terra, if our dry land is destroyed, we might have another place to go, which is the ocean. And this might solve all our problems. I'd rather advocate for a more porous utopia, one where the human is not sealed in a little station underwater. I'm thinking about Jacques Cousteau, for example, right? So Jacques Cousteau's cone shelf project that he did in the 19th tried to bring the human into an underwater world by literally sealing off the habitat. So they would just reproduce terra in agua. So they would just build these little bubbles, and humans were basically shut off from the marine environment. And when I say I'd argue for a more porous utopia, I'd say the point of thinking about underwater life, or the way that we can, as humans, be present there, is not to bring human habitat to the ocean, but to bring the concept of architecture as a way of providing a space to live in to the underwater world. And that doesn't mean that humans have to live there. That means that other critters can live there, or they can live there simultaneously. So, for example, what I find interesting are these moments of intersection where urban space is touching upon marine environments. So that can be former military zones, oil rigs, harbors that are not used anymore. All these infrastructures that humans have made and that reefs or marine critters have reclaimed also as a space to live in. And I think these contact zones where human interference comes into a new dialogue with marine life, they are really interesting. They are maybe not as utopist as to think about an entirely new constellation of life, but they are based on a real utopia, on the ruins that we have already left, the ruins of modernity that are already present at sea, that could be reclaimed and that could be reframed into habitat. I think that's where I would see a realistic fiction happening within the next decades, hopefully, but provided that we humans understand that these environments need to be reframed outside the normative divide of this is human space and this is so-called natural space.
I think that's an amazing answer to end this interview. And I will for sure be dreaming of porous utopias and reclaimed contact zones. Thank you so much, Rasa, for this interview. That was fascinating.
Thanks a lot for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed it. You can find all of our other episodes online on our platforms, as well as in our listening room in our exhibition space in Brooklyn, New York. Bye!